The paddle came out of nowhere. 1 second, I was standing under the pale strip light of the assembly hall, palms damp, feeling like all the oxygen had been quarried out of the room, and the next, the deputy marshaled it into the center like a conductor revealing the baton. It was an ordinary object, varnished maple, tapered, about 2 feet long. But in that place it was more like a relic, ritualized, infamous, and suddenly the fulcrum of every nerve in my body. They called it padding. Day at Linden, an old tradition that dated back to the school's earliest century. The ceremony was reserved for infractions that the administration deemed performative enough to be made public. Graffiti on the chapel doors, the stolen mascot head, the senior prank that had flooded a stairwell last month. The idea, the headmaster said in his measured voice, was not to shame but to mend. We administer a hurt that teaches, he told us in the email the week before, which some parents retweeted with approval and others with quiet outrage. I had brushed that phrase off. You can intellectually dismiss ritual until the moment you're the body in the ritual. I was 20, technically a Linden senior, and old enough to know the rules and young enough to test them. We had planned the prank as a commentary on the school's endless formality, an elaborate string of chalk messages that would appear across the quad during Provost Week, witty and harmless, made to dissolve in the rain. We wanted to poke that quiet, damped solemnity the school wore like a heavy sweater. It felt theatrical and clever, an inside joke about an institution that asks you to conform while promising to teach you to think. We were sloppy. We left footprints in the wrong place. One of our messages, an ill-advised line about order above all, rewritten as order, please, was chalked across the base of the headmaster's statue. A security camera had caught faint silhouettes. A week later, an email went out announcing the investigation results. 3 names. A hearing. Padding, if found appropriate. The sentence read like a conditional verdict. I thought my punishment would be an apology essay. Some hours cleaning the chapel, perhaps a loss of privileges. I had never been paddled. As a kid, my mother had smacked me for taking her car keys when I was 16, and the memory was a private, awkward sting I'd learned not to dramatize. This school ceremony was its own language. On the morning of the assembly, I tried to scaffold my courage. I ate dry toast, paced the dorm hall, rehearsed the words I would say if required, contrition without theatrics, accountability without a martyr's posture. My roommate Marco knocked on the door, slid a paper cup of coffee through the crack, and left without a word. He'd been through it last year. It's stupid, he'd said once. It's old. It does work, though. His wink had the kind of sympathy that's never quite harmless. The hall filled with the usual mix, parents in sensible coats, younger students with curious faces, faculty in collars that suggested they'd been baptized by policy rather than faith. The headmaster gave a small speech about community and consequence. The deputy read the infraction list like a priest reciting a litany. Then the 3 of us, me, Mara, and Devin, were called forward. The paddle lay on a mahogany table. There was a small white cloth folded under it, as if someone wanted to keep the wood pristine for the photograph the yearbook would later take. Mara's jaw was set. Devin looked elsewhere as if the ceiling tiles might be more consoling than the eyes around us. I felt small, despite being physically larger than both. The deputy's face was punctual and indifferent. He did not gloat. He had the professional calm of someone entrusted to convert policy into practice. You'll be given the standard padding, he said. 3 strokes. You may decline this procedure and request board review. The phrasing presented an illusion of choice, legalese dressing up a social inevitability. For most of the families present, the ritual was part of the contract. You enroll at Linden, you accept its customs. For others, it was a relic to be tolerated. I thought about appealing. I thought about the paperwork, the weight, the possibility of more punitive actions stretched over time. The prospect of delay offered means for anxiety to swell. It occurred to me that the quicker it was done, the less it would loom over everything else. When my name was called, the world narrowed to the sound of the floor under my shoes and my own breathing. I placed my hands on the bench the deputy indicated, hands flat, fingers splayed. My shirt rode up my spine. I felt the cool air against the patch of skin that would be exposed. For a second, the mind does a curious thing. It catalogs non-essential details as if hoarding normalcy. I thought of a misplaced textbook, the faint coffee stain on my wrist, the day my roommate had stolen my socks as a prank in freshman year. Then the first stroke landed. It was precise. The impact jolted, snaked through the muscles, and landed as something like arithmetic, sharp, finite. It was over before I could perform the melodrama I had rehearsed. No shriek, no theatrical collapse, just a reflexive breath and the abrupt awareness of connective tissue. The second stroke came in a rhythm that felt almost bureaucratic, applied, accounted for, logged. The third completed the set. The pain owned me for a single, crystalline moment, and then diffused into heat and a tightness that made sitting uncomfortable. What surprised me more than the physical sting was the emotional swell that followed. Shame and anger rolled through like opposing currents. Part of me wanted to blame the school, to rehearse a takedown of archaic practices. The other part felt something I had not expected. A small self-reproach for having expected to be above consequence. The ritual did what rituals do. It fixed a place for the violation and its correction. The assembly ended with a hush. People clapped, sparse, polite, the kind of clapping that seals an event but does not celebrate. Back in the dorm, heat pulsed in the area where the paddle had met skin. I took ibuprofen and lay face down on my bed for a while. Marco came in with sandwiches and tried to be irreverent about it. His jokes landed like stones. The practical headache of the next days, cooling gels, avoiding seatbelts that chafed, sitting awkwardly in lectures, was only part of the aftermath. The greater complication was social. Rumors twist and deeds become shorthand. For weeks, people referred to me with a small smirk, as if my past behavior was a file they kept on a shelf. It was oddly intimate and humiliating to have your misstep reduced to a nickname. But the story is not simple admonishment. The most interesting part of the aftermath was not the sting or the humiliation, but the slot it opened into conversation. Mara, who had a bone-deep distrust of administrative ritual, remained furious. She began organizing a petition. Devon retreated and kept to himself. I, for reasons I could not wholly explain at the time, sought out Ms. Rivera, an instructor in restorative practices who had quietly opposed corporal ritual behind the scenes, but also worked with students on campus mediation. "Why come to me?" she asked after I knocked on her office door, a room full of potted plants and books that smelled faintly of lemon. Her eyebrow rose like a question mark. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't want to be mad all the time. I don't want the school to be right about me forever. The paddle, it hurt. But that's not a useful narrative by itself." She smiled, and for a second, the world shifted. Ms. Rivera had a way of listening that felt like picking up a fragile object and turning it to see the engraving. We talked about what had happened, not to relitigate the act, but to unspool the choices. She asked me how I felt about the prank's intent, about what message we'd tried to send, and about whether the method had been worth the consequence. "It's complicated," I said. "We wanted to make a funny point. We also wanted to belong to something, an inside joke about the place that shaped us. But the chalk on the statue, that was careless. It wasn't a thoughtful protest. It was attention for the sake of attention. That's a useful distinction," she said. "Intent matters, but so does impact. You can have just motives and still cause harm." Our conversation turned to the idea of repair. Ms. Rivera introduced me to a series of practices that were not punitive but restorative. Apologies that involved listening, community service that addressed real needs, collaborative projects that made visible the work of care. The language was different from the headmaster's. He spoke of rules and preservation. She spoke of relationships and responsibility. "I'm not arguing we shouldn't change our traditions," she told me. "But let's make changes that actually transform how people behave, not just how they look. If a ritual humiliates without teaching, then we need alternatives. But if a system of consequence is only corrective because there isn't any care afterward, then the punishment becomes all the story we remember." I was skeptical in the way students in my generation tend to be skeptical, politely at first, then with a stubborn curiosity. Over the next weeks, I attended circles Ms. Rivera organized. We sat in a folding ring in the community room, voices bouncing between apology, explanation, and listening. We wrote letters to the campus about what we'd learned. We clean-washed the base of the headmaster's statue with the attention of people mending an old mistake. We volunteered to run floor meetings on conflict resolution. These acts were not spectacular. They were slow and laborious, the kind of unglamorous work that doesn't make for headlines. The paddling had been finite. The repair was ongoing. Not everyone saw it that way. Mara accused me of capitulation. "You're smoothing it over," she said, voice taut. "You let them convert your punishment into your reform, and now you're helping them keep the system." She organized a rally and sent op-eds to the student paper calling the school's ritual a medieval inheritance. There were sharp articles and letters to the editor with people on both sides. Parents lined up, lawyers sniffed, and the administration issued a statement promising to review practices in light of modern pedagogical standards. The board convened hearings. In public, they listened to parents. In private, the headmaster admitted that the paddle tradition had become more about optics than pedagogy, a performance that sometimes took the place of meaningful education. Change, as institutions discover, is slow and often requires a theater of negotiation. Committees formed, policies drafted, a pilot program proposed. What stuck with me most, though, was not the policy reform or the headlines. It was a quiet moment in the second week after the assembly when I found myself outside the student infirmary. A freshman named Lucy, bright with hair like a tumbleweed, had called me that morning. She had seen our chalk messages and wanted to know if I'd teach her how to be subversive in a smart way, a request equal parts admiration and irony. She was too nervous to go to the rally, too inexperienced in institutional firefighting to know how to direct her outrage. We sat on the infirmary steps and talked, really talked, about tactics and ethics. "It's weird," she said. "I thought being loud was the point, but you seem changed." I told her about Ms. Rivera and the circles, about how carrying accountability can be a kind of leadership instead of surrender. "You don't always have to accept the things that hurt you," I said, "but you can decide how to respond so the next person doesn't get the same hurt." She looked at me like I was a map. "So, is the paddle gone yet?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe it won't be for a while. But the thing we learned is that punishment without repair is a hole. If we want true change, we need to do things that fill those holes." Months passed. The board's recommendation came down slowly. A pilot program to replace public paddling with a two-part process: restorative circles, and, where appropriate and mutually agreed upon, a symbolic rite that did not cause physical pain, but required public acknowledgement and a service commitment. The change satisfied neither side completely. Parents who wanted the tradition preserved grumbled that a soft system wouldn't instill respect. Activists who wanted abolition declared it a half measure. But for many students, it meant an option that prioritized repair over spectacle. The paddle still existed in the archive, kept under glass in the hall like an artifact. Sometimes I passed it on my way to class and felt the memory like a phantom limb. I thought about how institutions hold on to objects not because they need them, but because objects narrate identity. The paddle, varnished and solemn, told a story of a school that had thought of discipline as an instrument of order and now had to reckon with the cost. There was a surprising twist to my own narrative. Because I had been paddled, and because I'd chosen a path of repair afterwards, some faculty asked me to help write the new policies. I felt a strange ambivalence. How often do you get asked to advise the institution that corrected you? There was a private irony in every meeting. I sat across from the very deputy who had once stood over me, both of us older a year or two, both of us bound by a shared investment in the place. We drafted language together, specific, bureaucratic, difficult to gamify. We insisted that any right be consent-based, that restorative circles be mandatory in cases of public infractions, and that educational projects accompany reparation. We wrote clauses about confidentiality and oversight. I learned how slow and careful institutional language must be to avoid loopholes. It was tedious and oddly sacred work. On the day the pilot policy officially launched, the headmaster invited me to speak at a faculty meeting. I stood at the podium, palms a little damp, and voiced the obvious. That physical punishment had a clarity to it that made it seem decisive, but that clarity often bypassed the heart of education, which is transformation. I said that repair, while messier, held the promise of changing behavior in durable ways. People applauded politely. Some nodded somberly. A few looked skeptical. It did not change everything. Habits persist. People return to the forms that feel efficient. But the policy, testy, compromised, imperfect, was a start. I'll say something here that's not celebratory or triumphant, only true. The paddle changed me. Not because it hurt in a particular way, but because it forced me to decide what kind of person I wanted to be after the punishment. I could have allowed the incident to forge me into a resentful iconoclast, forever railing against the institution. Instead, I took the sting as a clarifying point and tried to use it to make a different path. Years later, Linden's archives replaced the paddle's display plaque with one that acknowledged the school's history and its changes. The old implement remained in the case, but the label's tone had shifted from nostalgic to reflective. Tradition, the plaque read, must be examined because its holders change. When I think of that moment under the strip lights, hands flat on. The bench, breathing measured, I don't conjure anger so much as a ledger, lines of cause and consequence, reparations and small acts of restitution. The paddling itself was finite. The work that followed was not. It required humility to ask, for forgiveness and courage to pull others into raw conversations about harm. I sometimes wonder if there's an easy moral to be had. There isn't. Institutions are made of people who are fallible and people are messy. Traditions can be both harmful and heritage. What matters is the willingness to reframe discipline as part of an educational arc rather than a finality, to imagine that when we teach, we must also mend. The paddle came out of nowhere that day, but it didn't have to be the final word. It ended up being the beginning of questions we still answer, imperfectly, today.